December of 1989, a house in Howard Beach, Queens. A man 49 years old, dying of the cancer that had been spreading through his lungs for years, in a neighborhood he had known his entire life, waiting for a visit that was not coming. The man who would not come had been his closest friend since before either of them had a criminal record worth mentioning. They had grown up on the same streets, run with the same gang, been arrested together for the same petty crimes, and graduated together into the same organization. They had killed together. They had done prison time together. They had stood on a street in Midtown Manhattan on a December night 4 years earlier and watched the murder that changed everything. And then they had walked away together into a future that belonged entirely to one of them. The man who was dying had spent 3 decades making himself useful to the man who would not come. He had been an enforcer, an earner, a recruiter, a planner, and a captain. He had helped assemble the coalition that made the coup possible. He had helped coordinate the operation that installed his childhood friend as the boss of the most powerful criminal organization in the country. He had done all of this while talking so much and so freely that the federal government had been listening to his conversations for years, and the recordings they made in his house had set in motion a chain of surveillance that was still expanding as he lay dying. That is the story. The man who helped make John Gotti, boss of the Gambino crime family, was Angelo Ruggiero, and understanding what Gotti owed him and why Gotti would not go, it requires understanding who both men actually were, where they came from, and what the world between them actually cost. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is one of the best parts of putting these together. If you are new here and want more history like this, hit subscribe now. Back to Howard Beach and the two men whose story cannot be understood apart from each other. They were born the same year, in the same city, into the same kind of poverty, and they found each other in the same neighborhood before either of them was old enough to understand what kind of world they were growing up in. Both were born in 1940 in New York City. Both were raised in East New York, Brooklyn, a neighborhood already threaded through with the organizational presence of what would eventually become the Gambino crime family. Both were high school dropouts. Both joined the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a street gang with direct connections to the men who ran things in the neighborhood, and it was there, in the company of that gang, that Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti first found each other and first understood that they were going to make the same choices. Angelo Ruggiero was stocky and loud and physically imposing in the way that certain men are imposing, not because of their size alone, but because of the quality of attention they demand from a room. He smoked 4 packs of Marlboro cigarettes a day, a habit that started in adolescence and never stopped, and the voice it produced over the years was described by one law enforcement official as sounding like a cement truck mixer. He also walked with a duck-like waddle caused by plantar fasciitis, a painful condition of the feet that gave him his gait and contributed to the nickname that would eventually define his legacy inside the organization. The nickname was Quack, Quack. It was earned on 2 counts, the walk and the talking. The talking was the defining fact of Angelo Ruggiero's existence. He could not stop. He visited other members of the organization at their homes whenever possible and subjected them to running commentaries on everything around him, on who had offended him, on who was earning and who was not, on what he thought of the men above him in the hierarchy. Everyone who spent time with him had to endure it. One of his fellow captains, John Canaglia, eventually summarized the situation in a line that was itself captured on a surveillance recording. Dial any 7 numbers, and there is a 50-50 chance Angelo will answer the phone. It was the most complete description anyone produced of the man, and it had the added distinction of being accurate. His juvenile arrest record covered street fighting, public intoxication, car theft, bookmaking, possession of an illegal firearm, and burglary. Several of these arrests were made in the company of Gotti. In 1966, both men were arrested together for attempting to steal a cement mixer truck. The arrests accumulated. Meaningful jail time did not follow. Neither man extracted any lesson from this pattern except the confirmation that consequences could be managed. Ruggiero had a structural advantage inside the world they were both entering that Gotti did not initially possess. His mother's brother was Agnello della Croce, who was already a significant figure in the organization that Albert Anastasia ran and that Carlo Gambino was about to inherit. The family connection gave Ruggiero access and a degree of protection that his street-level abilities alone would not have secured. It did not give him a close personal relationship with Della Croce, who by multiple accounts was considerably warmer toward Gotti than toward his own nephew. What it gave him was a name that opened doors and a floor beneath him when he made the kind of mistakes that would have ended anyone else. The friendship with Gotti gave him something different and more durable, a bond that predated the organization entirely, built from 20 years of shared streets and shared consequences, and that would govern both their lives long after the organization should have pulled them apart. Well, by the time they were formally made men, inducted into the Gambino family in a ceremony presided over by Paul Castellano himself, the friendship between Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti was already 20 years old, built from a street life that the ceremony did nothing to create and that the organization they were joining would eventually do everything to destroy. The organization they were eventually inducted into had been through several violent transformations by the time they were old enough to be of use to it. Albert Anastasia was murdered in October of 1957, shot while sitting in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, and Carlo Gambino assumed control of the family that would bear his name. Gambino reorganized the hierarchy and kept Della Croce as underboss, a position Della Croce would hold for nearly 3 decades, running his operations from the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy. It was to the Ravenite that Gotti would eventually travel regularly to brief the underboss, building the personal relationship with Della Croce that would shape his entire organizational career. Gambino died in October of 1976 and passed leadership not to Della Croce, which the street-level membership expected and wanted, but to his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. Castellano was a businessman's boss, more interested in construction contracts and legitimate-appearing enterprises than in the daily work of running crews. He lived in a 17-room mansion in Todd Hill, Staten Island, and he ran the family like a corporation from that remove. The resentment this created among Della Croce's faction was real and documented. Della Croce accepted the succession in the name of family unity. The men around him, Gotti and Ruggiero among them, accepted it with considerably less grace. Castellano imposed a rule that would eventually become the central collision point of everything that followed. Narcotics dealing was banned, under penalty of death. He made the edict explicit and made the penalty clear. The problem was that by the time he issued it, the narcotics business was already operating inside his own family, managed by people he could not easily see from his Tot Hill estate. The fiction that kept it hidden had been in place for years before the induction ceremony of July 1977, when Castellano, Della Croce, and Consigliere Joseph N. Gallo presided over the formal making of Angelo Ruggiero and John Gotti as members of the family they had already been serving for a decade. At that ceremony, both men pledged their loyalty to an organization whose most important rule they were already planning to violate. Before there was a capo's title or a boss's seat, there was a bar on Staten Island on the night of May 22nd, 1973, and a job that Carlo Gambino himself had assigned. A man named James McBratney had kidnapped Emanuele Gambino, the 29-year-old nephew of the family's boss, collected the ransom, and killed Emanuele anyway. Gambino wanted McBratney found and killed. A hit team was assembled that included Gotti, Ruggiero, and a gunman named Ralph Gallioni. The plan was to lure McBratney out of the bar he was drinking in. He refused. Gallione shot him dead in front of witnesses while his accomplices held him. It was not a clean operation. It was a committed one. Both men were identified by witnesses and eventually convicted, not of murder, as the act warranted, but of manslaughter, the charge that Roy Cohn's negotiation produced. They served time at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania and were released on parole in July of 1977. What the McBratney killing established about the friendship was something the formal ceremony of induction could not have created. They had done the same job, taken the same consequence, and come out the other side still committed to each other. The organizational code recognized this kind of shared violence as a bond. In this case, it was also simply true. After their release, both men returned to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, which served as the crew's operational headquarters. Gotti managed the crew's illegal gambling operation and proved himself as an enforcer. Ruggiero worked alongside him as one of the most reliable members of the Bergen operation, and his no-show employment at Arc Plumbing and Heating Corporation, a company owned by Gambino associates Anthony and Cesar Guarino, satisfied his parole conditions without requiring him to do anything resembling actual work. Every other Sunday, Ruggiero drove to Castellano's Tot Hill mansion to report on the Bergen crew's activities and earnings. The visits were required. His private assessment of the man he was reporting to was not something he kept to himself in the years that followed. He referred to Castellano as a milk drinker and a pansy. He called Castellano's sons, who ran a business called Dial Poultry, the chicken men. He called Castellano's business advisors the Jew Club. He referred to Thomas Gambino, who oversaw the family's interests in the garment industry, as a sissy dressmaker. He performed the required deference in person and returned home to say what he actually thought, often in the presence of people he had no reason to trust with his opinions. By the time he said all of it on tape, he had been saying it for years. He had been doing it for years, talking when he should have been quiet, trusting when he should have been careful, certain that the life he was living could not be heard by anyone who was not already part of it. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong for longer than he knew. Salvatore Ruggiero, Angelo's older brother, was everything Angelo was not, in the ways that mattered to survival. He was quiet where Angelo was loud, still where Angelo was in perpetual motion, capable of the kind of sustained discretion that Angelo could not maintain for more than a conversation. Born July the 20th, 1945, Salvatore had been involved in heroin trafficking since at least 1970, and had been careful enough about it to maintain the fiction that he was earning through other means. The organization nominally prohibited narcotics dealing. The money from Salvatore's operation was attributed to truck hijackings. Carmine Fatico accepted his share of the proceeds under that fiction, and the fiction held because everyone with a stake in it agreed not to examine it. By the late 1970s, Salvatore was a multi-millionaire fugitive from 3 federal indictments charging extortion, tax evasion, and narcotics trafficking. He had been living under assumed names in hideouts across New Jersey, Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania for years. He secretly owned properties registered under other names in multiple states, including a mansion under construction in Franklin Lakes, New Jersey, being built through the same company, run by Anthony and Cesar Guarino, that gave Angelo his no-show employment. He owned 4 cars, 10 watches worth $12,000 each, and a fleet of investment properties he moved through aliases and trusted associates. He purchased his heroin from Gerlando Sciascia, a Sicilian-born Bonanno family, capo, known in the trade as George from Canada, who was regularly smuggling tons of product into New York from Montreal and selling large quantities on consignment. On May 6, 1982, Salvatore boarded the private Learjet he had chartered from Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, bound for Florida with his wife Stephanie to look at investment property. The plane went down in the Atlantic Ocean approximately 12 miles southeast of Savannah, Georgia. Everyone aboard was killed. Both Salvatore and Stephanie had been fugitives at the time of their deaths. At the moment the plane hit the water, an entire heroin shipment purchased on credit from Sciascia was sitting in one of Salvatore's New Jersey properties, waiting for his return. Angelo was notified of the crash and went immediately, along with Gene Gotti and John Carneglia, Salvatore's Franklin Lakes hideout to recover the heroin and whatever cash was in the property. The FBI had already wired Angelo's home by the time this happened, and everything that followed was recorded. The federal surveillance of Angelo Ruggiero had begun months before the plane crash, built on a foundation that included an informant whose assistance was both specific and motivated by personal animosity. Wilfred Johnson, known inside the Bergen crew as Willie Boy and assigned the FBI codename Wahoo, had been cooperating with the Bureau since 1966. He harbored a particular dislike of Ruggiero that showed up in the language of his informant reports, where he referred to him as that fat fuck, when he directed the FBI's attention toward Ruggiero's activities, while deliberately excluding Gotti from his accounts of the crew's narcotics operations. His most operationally significant contribution was not the intelligence he provided about what Ruggiero was doing. It was the detailed floor plans of the Ruggiero home in Cedarhurst, New York, accompanied by specific recommendations on optimal locations to install listening devices. The first wiretap authorization was signed on November 9, 1981, by Federal Judge Henry Bramwell of the Eastern District of New York. The authorization named Ruggiero, John Gotti, Gene Gotti, Frank Guidis, and Jackie Cavallo as intercept targets, and covered the home phone at Ruggiero's Howard Beach, Queens residence, which was listed in his daughter Princess Ruggiero's name because Ruggiero had told associates it was safe. He had moved to Cedarhurst by December of that year, and subsequent authorizations followed him. On April 5, 1982, agents disguised as construction workers entered the Cedarhurst home and installed listening devices in the kitchen, the dining room, and the basement den. The authorization was extended by subsequent 30-day orders on May 7th and June 7th of 1982. 6 separate surveillance orders were issued in total, covering the period from November of 1981 through July of 1982. Ruggiero spent $40,000 remodeling the Cedarhurst home and was recorded telling associates that the bugs in this house were a bunch of bullshit and nothing was coming. The devices he was assuring his associates did not exist captured this remark. They captured everything else as well: the loan sharking, the gambling, the heroin. The attorney Michael Coiro, visiting after Salvatore's death and saying to those present that Gene had found the heroin. Those words gave the investigating agents a direct evidentiary connection between Salvatore's drug inventory and Gene Gotti, and they gave Bruce Mao, who ran the FBI's Gambino squad, exactly the kind of recorded moment that an investigation built on wiretap evidence needed most. Mao had held off making arrests throughout the surveillance period, hoping to capture John Gotti at Ruggiero's home or on one of the phone taps discussing the heroin. It did not happen. Gotti maintained a discipline that Ruggiero never managed. He held to a rule about not visiting the home of a soldier, and whatever else he discussed in other settings, he appears never to have discussed the narcotics operation in a location where the FBI could capture him doing it. The contrast between Gotti's operational caution and Ruggiero's complete inability to exercise the same caution is the structural irony at the center of the entire story. Gotti was protected, in part, by the friend whose talking created the danger, and the friend never stopped talking long enough for the protection to hold indefinitely. On August 8, 1983, 17 months after the plane crash, the Gambino squad arrested Angelo Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, John Carneglia, Michael Coiro, Mark Reiter, and several others. 2 kilograms of heroin, worth approximately $300,000 on the street, were seized during the arrests. 12 defendants were named in the indictment, with 5 others sought. The charges included conspiracy to distribute heroin and continuing criminal enterprise. Paul Castellano learned that his own home had been bugged by the FBI at approximately the same time that he was processing his anger about what the existence of the Ruggiero tapes implied. The legal authorization for the bug in his Todd Hill mansion had come directly from the recordings made inside Ruggiero's Cedarhurst house. Ruggiero's inability to stop talking had given the government the legal predicate to surveil the boss of the entire family. Castellano wanted the transcripts of Ruggiero's recorded conversations, all which his lawyers needed to suppress his own recordings in the upcoming Mafia Commission trial. Ruggiero refused absolutely. He told his own lawyers he would kill them if they gave up the tapes. He accused his uncle Della Croce of betrayal for entertaining the idea that the tapes should be produced. His stated justification was personal embarrassment. His actual reason, which Sammy Gravano later confirmed in testimony, was that the tapes documented drug dealing that, if Castellano heard it in its full specificity, would result in executions. The tapes were not a legal problem. They were a death sentence waiting to happen. Della Croce was caught between his nephew and his boss, and he managed the situation the way men in his position always manage the unmanageable. He stalled. He told Castellano that the tapes contained embarrassing personal material that Ruggiero was unwilling to share, and he promised that they would eventually be produced through the legal process. Castellano accepted this for a time. The stalling kept both Ruggiero and the peace, because Della Croce was the one figure in the organization with enough standing and credibility to hold both sides back from the conclusion the situation was pointing toward. Gravano's later assessment of this period was direct. He stated that he did not believe Gotti genuinely cared about Ruggiero or the tapes during the dispute. His reading was that Gotti was using the conflict with Castellano over the transcripts as a mechanism to articulate and build grievances that already existed for other reasons: the narcotics ban, the airport hijacking splits, the isolation of a boss who managed the family from a Staten Island estate while his captains struggled in the streets below him. The tape dispute was the presenting complaint. The actual agenda was already taking shape. In September of 1985, Ruggiero approached Gravano through an intermediary, the family's pornography operation manager Robert DiBernardo, to recruit Gravano's support for the plan to remove Castellano. Ruggiero was not the political architect of what followed. He was the recruiter. Gotti gave the direction. Ruggiero carried the message to the people Gotti needed, aligned. It was, in miniature, exactly the role Ruggiero had always played. Not the strategist, but the indispensable mechanism by which the strategy became operational. Angelo Della Croce died of cancer on December 2nd, 1985. Ruggiero had been a constant presence at his uncle's bedside throughout the final weeks, sitting with the man who had served as his protection inside the organization and who had, for years, stood between his nephew's recklessness and its natural consequences. With Della Croce dead, the single figure capable of managing the tension between Castellano's demand and the Gotti faction's refusal was gone. Castellano did not attend Della Croce's wake. In the world these men inhabited, an absence of that kind was not neutral. It was a statement, and everyone in the organization understood what it said. 2 weeks later, Castellano was dead. December the 16th, 1985, Midtown Manhattan, East 46th Street, outside Sparks Steakhouse, at approximately 5:30 in the evening, the holiday shopping season. People in the street who had no idea what was about to happen on that block. 4 shooters in beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats waited near the restaurant entrance. Among them were Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia. Additional backup shooters, including Angelo Ruggiero and Dominic Pizzonia, were positioned further down the street. Gotti and Gravano sat in a car across the street with walkie-talkies, watching for Castellano's arrival. Thomas Bellotti, Castellano's driver and newly named underboss, pulled the car to the curb. Castellano stepped out. The shooters moved. Castellano was shot multiple times. Bellotti was shot simultaneously as he exited the driver's door. John Carneglia delivered what witnesses described as the killing shot to Castellano's head. Gotti had the car driven slowly past the bodies to confirm the kills. Ruggiero was in the street that night as backup. He was never called into action. His more substantial contribution to what happened had come in the months before: the recruitment, the alignment, the organizational work of building a coalition capable of executing a plan that no boss had been murdered without commission approval in decades. Gravano would later recall in an account of the planning that the distinctive fashion the shooters wore, the matching coats and hats that made it impossible to tell one man from another in the dark, may have been Ruggiero's idea. Gravano was not certain. The record does not establish it definitively. What the record does establish is that Ruggiero was present, that he had helped build the conditions that made the night possible, and that he was about to collect the most significant organizational reward of his life, On January 15th, 1986, John Gotti was formally acclaimed boss of the Gambino crime family at a meeting of 20 capos. He appointed Frank DeCicco as underboss. He promoted Angelo Ruggiero to capo regime of the Bergen crew, the position Gotti himself had held before ascending. The family Gotti now commanded had an estimated annual income of $500 million, 23 active crews, approximately 300 inducted members, and more than 2,000 associates. Ruggiero held the title he had spent 30 years earning. He would hold it for less than 3 years. The problems began almost immediately. Learn they were Ruggiero's problems in the specific sense that they were produced by the same qualities that had always defined him. As capo under Gotti's direction, he had been assigned responsibility for the organizational work of contract killing. He was not suited to it. When Ruggiero heard that Anthony Casso of the Lucchese family had called him an idiot, he ordered Casso's murder without clearing it through Gotti, a unilateral decision to move against a made member of a rival family that violated the protocol those relationships required. The hitman assigned to the job was James Heidel, a Gambino associate. Heidel shot Casso 5 times in Brooklyn in September of 1986. Casso survived. He recovered, and when he was well enough, he arranged through corrupt NYPD detectives Stephen Caracappa and Luis Ippolito to have Heidel abducted and delivered to him. Casso tortured Heidel for approximately 12 hours, shooting him a reported 14 times before killing him. The operation that was supposed to remove a rival who had insulted Ruggiero had instead produced a dead associate, an enraged survivor, and a new source of interfamily tension that compounded the organizational damage already in progress. In June of 1986, Ruggiero arranged the murder of Robert DiBernardo, who had been among those who helped build the coalition against Castellano. Gotti ordered the killing from jail, relayed through Ruggiero to Gravano, who carried it out. DiBernardo was shot twice in the back of the head, and his death was the most direct product of Ruggiero's role as the operational mechanism between Gotti and the men who executed his orders. The Ruggiero recordings had extended the investigation into rooms Ruggiero had never entered. The legal authority established by those recordings had been used to justify the surveillance of Castellano's Tot Hill home, which produced the recordings that led to the Mafia Commission trial of 1985. That trial resulted in the conviction of bosses and senior figures across multiple New York families for racketeering and conspiracy. The heroin case against Ruggiero, John Gotti, and Carneglia produced 3 separate trials. The first ended in a mistrial because of jury tampering. The Gambino family had compromised the jury and the case had to be retried. The second also ended in a mistrial, for the same reason. By the third trial in 1989, Ruggiero was too ill to stand trial. He had been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. The years of smoking had produced the outcome that 4 packs of Marlboro cigarettes a day, sustained across decades, will reliably produce. He was severed from the third proceeding before the verdict came down. John Gotti and Carneglia were convicted and sentenced to 50 years each. During the period of his trials in a Manhattan hospital receiving chemotherapy, Ruggiero was reportedly overheard announcing that he was giving up his usual brand of cigarettes and switching to a recessed filter variety that would, he insisted, in direct contradiction of all available medical evidence, not damage his lungs. The detail is not comic. It is the same failure to assess his own situation accurately that had governed every significant decision of his criminal career. The man who told his associates the bugs in his house were a bunch of bullshit was the same man who believed in a cancer ward that the problem was the filter. Gotti's fury during this period was real, documented in Gravano's subsequent testimony, and growing. By the time the full scope of the surveillance chain had become visible, Gotti was reportedly considering ordering Ruggiero's murder. The offense, in Gotti's accounting, was that Ruggiero had allowed himself to be recorded, and the recordings had cost the family in ways that were still accumulating. Gravano argued against it on practical grounds. Ruggiero was dying of cancer, and killing a dying man served no organizational purpose and created unnecessary exposure. Gotti accepted the argument, The alternative to murder was the shelf. Ruggiero was stripped of his rank as capo regime and severed from all organizational activity. He was cut off from the family he had spent his entire adult life inside, formally and completely. Being placed on the shelf was not a formal ceremony. There was no meeting called for the purpose, no document drawn up, no official record of the moment. There was simply the understanding, communicated through the channels by which all such understandings traveled, that Angelo Ruggiero was no longer a functioning part of the organization. He could not attend meetings. He could not collect earnings. He could not associate with the men he had spent 30 years alongside. John Gotti Jr. refused to honor this entirely. He had been inducted into the Gambino family on Christmas Eve of 1988 in a ceremony that Gravano conducted specifically to prevent accusations of nepotism from falling on Gotti Sr. directly. Despite his father's position toward Ruggiero, Gotti Jr. maintained his contact with his father's oldest friend. He spoke to Ruggiero regularly during the period of the shelving and the illness. He did not cut the connection that his father had severed. The gesture is documented and is notable precisely because it ran against the direction of organizational gravity. The relationship between the Ruggiero and Gotti families was something that survived in that younger generation, the decisions the older generation had made about each other. During the last months of Angelo Ruggiero's life, two men who had known him for decades went to John Gotti with the same request, separately, and received the same answer. Sammy Gravano went to Gotti and urged him to visit. Gene Gotti, facing his own sentence, also made the appeal. Both were told no. Gotti's stated reason, according to Gravano's testimony after he turned state's evidence, was that he was still angry over Ruggiero's criminal activities being recorded on the wiretaps and what those recordings had cost the family. The anger was real. The costs were not hypothetical. They were measured in convictions, sentences, and the ongoing pressure of an investigation that had already reached inside the organization more deeply than any prior effort had managed. Whether the stated reason was the complete account of why Gotti would not go is a question the record does not fully resolve. Gravano's reading was that Gotti had made a decision about what Ruggiero had cost him and was not prepared to set that accounting aside, not even at the end. The organizational logic and the personal anger had converged into a single position, and Gotti held it. What the refusal cost Ruggiero in his final weeks is not something the historical record can measure. He was 49 years old, dying in Howard Beach, Queens, in the neighborhood he had shared with Gotti, since before either of them had anything a court would call a criminal history. He knew that Gotti knew he was dying. He knew that Gotti had been asked to come. He knew what the absence meant in the language of the world they had both spent their lives inside. Angelo Ruggiero died on December 4th, 1989. The cancer had run its course. He was 49 years old. When the time came to acknowledge his death publicly, Gravano reported that he had nearly had to drag Gotti to the wake. The distinction Gotti maintained between the wake and the deathbed was precise and deliberate. A wake is a public obligation, dischargeable without the intimacy of a bedside. A deathbed visit is a personal one, requiring the acknowledgement of something that cannot be managed through the formalities of organizational protocol. Gotti met the public obligation. He refused the personal one. The precision of that distinction was, in its way, an entirely legible statement about how he had decided to categorize what Ruggiero had been and what Ruggiero had done. The Ravenite apartment bug, planted over Thanksgiving weekend of 1989, had been recording conversations for 3 weeks when Ruggiero died. The recordings it captured in the weeks and months that followed would eventually produce the evidence that destroyed what Ruggiero had helped build. Gotti spoke about the murders of Di Bernardo, Liborio Milito, and Luis Di Bono with a candor that suggested he had genuinely believed the room was beyond the reach of anyone who might want to listen. On December 12, 1989, 8 days after Ruggiero died, Gotti told his consigliere, Frank Locascio, about the Di Bernardo killing. He said he had been in jail when the order was given, that he had known why it was being done, and that he had done it anyway. On Di Bono, he was more direct still. Di Bono was going to die because he had refused to come in when called, and he had not done anything else wrong. On multiple recordings, Gotti also described murders in ways that shifted the responsibility toward Gravano, characterizing Gravano as the force behind killings they had ordered together, calling him too greedy, implying that Gravano had pushed for deaths that served Gravano's interests rather than the organization's. Gravano was in detention awaiting trial when he listened to those recordings. He processed what he heard. He drew conclusions. In November of 1991, Gravano agreed to cooperate with the federal government, becoming the highest-ranking member of the American mob ever to break the organizational code of silence. On March 2, 1992, Gravano took the stand in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn and laid out the Castellano murder, the organization's structure, and the documented record of Gotti's role in each of the murders the indictment named. He was cross-examined for days. He did not break. The jury believed him. April 2nd, 1992, 14 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all 13 counts: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, illegal gambling, extortion, loan sharking, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gene Gotti and John Carneglia were each serving 50-year sentences. Michael Coiro had been convicted. Gravano received 5 years for his cooperation. John Gotti entered the federal prison system in June of 1992 and never came out free. He died on June 10, 2002, of throat cancer at 61 years old. Angelo Ruggiero Jr., the son of the man who had helped build everything Gotti commanded, was convicted of grand larceny in May of 1998 and sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison. He was not inducted into the Gambino family. Neither was his cousin Salvatore Ruggiero Jr., while multiple sources attribute this specifically to the organizational damage that the senior Ruggiero's recordings had produced. The consequences of the tapes reached into the next generation, shaping what the family would and would not offer to the people connected by blood to the man who had helped make it all possible. The chain that began in Angelo Ruggiero's kitchen in the spring of 1982 had run without interruption for a decade. His phone in his daughter's name, his house that was supposed to be safe, his $40,000 renovation that he believed had made everything secure, his confidence recorded by the devices he was confident did not exist. These were the first links. From them came the surveillance of Castellano's home, and from that came the commission trial, and the legal pressure that helped accelerate Gotti's decision to kill his boss, and Gotti's assumption of power, and the Ravenite meetings that gave the FBI a directory of the family's entire senior structure, and the widow's apartment above the club that captured Gotti blaming Gravano for murders they had committed together, and Gravano deciding he had heard enough, and the Brooklyn courtroom where everything ended. Ruggiero did not know how long the chain would run. He was dead before most of it played out. But the voice that had been his defining characteristic, the same voice that had made him the indispensable recruiter, the necessary connector, the man who could walk into any room and make things happen through the force of his presence and his willingness to talk. He was also the voice that the FBI captured in 6 separate surveillance operations and used as the legal foundation for everything that followed. What the refusal meant, finally, is not a question with a clean answer. Gotti's anger was real, and its basis was documented. The organizational logic of the refusal was legible, and yet the refusal was also something other than pure organizational logic. It was the withdrawal of a recognition that 30 years of partnership had earned, performed in the most irreversible way available, at the moment when it could not be appealed or reconsidered. Ruggiero died in December of 1989 without the acknowledgement that the code they had both lived under said he had earned. Whether Gotti believed he owed it is something no surviving record establishes. What the record does establish is this: the man who helped design the murder that made Gotti boss also helped make the recordings that eventually destroyed everything Gotti built. The man who helped build the king refused to go to the man dying in Howard Beach. The man in Howard Beach had spent 49 years talking, and the talking had cost everything it was supposed to protect, and the man he had done it alongside was still alive when the accounting was made, and chose not to come. Gravano nearly had to drag him to the wake. The tapes were still playing in rooms Ruggiero would never see. The chain he started in his kitchen in the spring of 1982 was still running when everything else had stopped. He had helped too much. He had talked too much. He had been, in the end, too much of everything the world he built required, and not enough of the one thing that might have saved him, the discipline to understand that some conversations should never happen, and that the rooms you believe are safe are the rooms that cost you most.